A civil disobedience campaign in Peru, which has included strikes, roadblocks, and marches, is now entering its third month. However, they have only recently gained international attention due to a bloody crackdown on the part of the Peruvian government. The resistance movement took form over 1 year ago in response to a collection of government decrees which eased restrictions on resource extraction in the Peruvian rainforest, rich in oil and minerals. The decrees were put forward in order to conform to a series of recent free trade agreements, including those signed with the United States and Canada. The U.S. is home to 3 of the world's 6 largest oil companies, while roughly 60% of the world's mining companies have their headquarters in Canada, and those companies are active in over 100 countries. Over 2 days of violence in the state of Amazonas last week, 23 police officers and at least 40 protesters, possibly many more, were killed. The government of Alan Garcia has levied the blame for the violence on Alberto Pisongo, the elected leader of ADESEP, the Inter-Ethnic Association of Peruvian Rainforest Development. The government put out a call for Pisongo's arrest on charges of sedition. Pisongo has since succeeded in gaining political asylum from the Nicaraguan embassy in Lima. The Real News spoke to independent journalist Powless, who joined us via broadband from the town of Jaén in Peru's Amazon basin.
I met with some of the leaders today, and they said, our cause isn't about Pisongo. It's not about the national leader. Our cause is about defending our land and our communities. And what really emerged and what really has been vibrantly shown here is that this was very much locally organized efforts. Leading up to the protests and in some of the national strikes that happened before, there were literally over 1,000 communities that took part in some of these protests and some of the strikes that happened. There's no way, I think, that the government could seriously allege that this was led by one man, nor do they understand the structure of the IDESEP, the Indigenous Amazonian Organization, because Alberto Pisongo's role as president was mostly as an interlocutor, was mostly as a spokesperson. Especially what happened here had nothing to do with anything that Pisongo has done before. This really the fault for this, as has been said by the ex-president, has been said by families of deceased police and military, really lies squarely on the government, who went through with the really badly planned operation in the first place that ended up with the loss of lives of a number of police officers, a number of indigenous groups and non-indigenous groups. But in the first place, they didn't go through with promoting dialogue, which was what Pisongo and his group had been calling for in a 55-day-long peaceful demonstration. They had just been demonstrating peacefully within the area, and then the most that they had done was called for a few strikes and stopped a few roads from going through. And the government's response to sending the military, heavily armed military and police, the general population rose up against the police there. And it's actually an interesting incident. A lot of reporters have skipped the fact that this was not an indigenous protest. We heard testimony today from a man who was actually shot by the police there. A number of bodies were coming in to Bagua City, which is a major city, from the outskirts of town where the main protest was happening by the indigenous Amazonian groups. And all of a sudden, all of these ambulances and other cars starting to arrive to town with a bunch of indigenous peoples that had been shot and wounded, and some of them were dead. And this produced a lot of anger amongst people of the town, who really supported the indigenous struggle and the Amazonian cause, especially being in an Amazonian area themselves. And so they actually started to protest in front of the police station there, and there were efforts, I think, to try and take it over, at which point police got on top of their own rooftops and started firing live ammunition to the crowd, as well as tear gas to disperse people. And that turned into a bit of an ongoing battle throughout the day. And eventually the military was brought in later that night to stabilize the town, which there's military still on the outskirts of the town. And from what we've heard, they do come in after the curfew settles down to make sure that nobody's out on the street, nothing's happening. It's basically become a militarized town.
Estimates of the number of dead protesters have ranged anywhere from 25 to 250, depending on the source.
That kind of information has been the most difficult to come by here, because what you have to understand here is that there were thousands of indigenous groups from the Amazon that came to participate in these protests. A lot of them came from communities that are 3-4 days away. So a lot of them are only just now returning to their towns, if they have returned at all. We came across 2 van loads of people leaving the hospital today with wounded, returning to their communities. And so it's just a matter of trying to coordinate a lot of the information from these communities to say, actually, 7 people didn't show up from our community, 5 people didn't show up here, we don't know where they are, as well as the fact that there's a few hundred people that are still locked up in various jails around the area. It's very difficult to actually figure out where anybody is and how many people are missing, how many people are dead.
President Garcia has labeled the protesters as extremists bent on slowing the country's economic development.
Un país que está marchando bien, según los analistas y el mundo, si se deja vencer por pequeños grupos, porque en el fondo son pequeños grupos que no representan lo más avanzado en el país, entonces es un país que está condenado a detenerse o a retroceder.
Thursday's events showed the movement to be much larger than Garcia lets on. Unions and student groups joined in the protests, bringing the issue right to the front door of Congress in the Peruvian capital of Lima, where they clashed with police. While inside Congress, opposition politicians themselves joined in the strike, shutting down the day's session to show their disapproval over the government's actions. Meanwhile, the government has withdrawn controversial commercials it had been running on Peruvian television since the killings last week.
22 humildes policías asesinados con ferocidad y salvajismo. No hubo enfrentamientos, hubo asesinato. Fueron cobardemente degollados cuando se encontraban desarmados e indefensos. A esto le llama diálogo el extremismo, pero los extremistas, por consigna internacional, quieren detener al Perú. Quieren impedir que los peruanos se beneficien con el gas y el petróleo de su subsuelo. Unámonos contra el crimen. Que la patria no pierda lo avanzado.
Indigenous leaders here have made clear that they're not against development. They're not against development of the nation. They're not against, so-called progress. But it has to be really well defined what's meant by progress, what's meant by development. Because for them, what a lot of them have said is that they've seen a lot of, so-called development come to their communities and dam projects and mining projects, which have not done anything for their communities, but instead have brought a lot of destruction, a lot of diseases, a lot of deaths to their communities, a lot of poverty in many situations. And so what they've said instead is that they need, responsible types of development, responsible types of, modernization. The second point is that they want to have control over what happens, of course, in the territories that they've traditionally always lived on. I mean, you're talking about literally hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples that live in this area of the Amazon, the second biggest stretch of the Amazon outside of Brazil. And they're basically calling for rights that have been established by various conventions, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which clearly establishes, along with the Labor Organization Convention 169, the basic right that indigenous communities have over development in their territories that's going to affect them. And so they've been saying that the way the government has been going about this has been preclusive of their rights and of their participation in the negotiations, and doesn't allow them to say over the kind of development that happens. The third point is that they've been also very clear that what these bills represent is an entrenchment and a furtherization of the neoliberal agenda into the Amazon area, and that it basically opens up 70% of the Amazon area in Peru to foreign multinationals coming in. And to argue that these communities will not be impacted, I think, cannot be defended from a scientific perspective, at the very least. If just take a look at the impact of, for example, water by any sort of mineral extraction, any sort of agricultural production.
The Peruvian Congress voted on Wednesday to suspend for 90 days one of the most controversial decrees in order to begin a dialogue over the issue. Nonetheless, Thursday's national strike went ahead as planned. IDESEP, the umbrella organization which claims to represent 1,350 Amazonian communities, has not been invited to participate in the dialogue. IDESEP's vice president, Daisy Zapata Fasabi, now acting as president, declared on Thursday that this dialogue proposal only reaffirms the government's anti-democratic spirit, adding further, "It saddens me to see the government continue with its policy of dividing the indigenous movement, instead of looking for ways to achieve the protection and development of the Amazon."